And the project actually has started in December 2019. And after the year exchange, Taiwan and South America artists, they worked through the remote collaboration to co-create the artwork and adapt them into the local environmental condition from Taiwan, and to extend the topic of environmental sensory. So the artists will introduce each individual art practice, and later we will have a small discussion, and in the end will be the QA time. So in that time you can leave your questions, you can leave it in the chat room or turn on your camera or a microphone to tell us. And also we will put the Chinese translation in the chat room. Today we invite 6 participating artists to share their practice context and how do they make the environmental observation and translate it into their art practice. And for first artist we will have is Luíza Bastos Lages from Brazil. I hope I pronounced your name right. And her works are often an articulation of writing, sculptural objects, and the moving image, which in dialogue result in installations with varying formats and make her works become a more poetic expression, and to make the audience to rethink about the structure of coloniality and the history behind the materials. So Luíza, please.
Hello, everybody. Hi, friends. Hello, Sophie. Thank you for your very kind words and introduction. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight in extension to today in Taiwan. Thank you for taking the time to join us and celebrate with us. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the project. I am very pleased and very excited to be part of it. So as I begin to share a few perceptions with you, I would like to acknowledge that I occupy the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tequesta, the Ais, the Giagas, and the Mayaimi peoples, nowadays dominantly named as South Florida. I have been living in the United States, however, only for the past 3.5 years. I originally come from inland Brazil, from a small mining town named Itabirito, located in the ancestral and also unceded territory of the Guarachués. I come from a mestiça family, socialized as white and educated within Western systems of knowledge. So I'm not indigenous, nor was my life and subjectivity formed by indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies, though these inform my thinking. I'm sharing this with you to inform you of my locus of enunciation, that is, my situated perspective and my situated words. My work that is part of the show, the project Plastic Soup, Invisible Matters, is called Paisagens Ficcionais, which means fictional landscapes in English. And this work is a film installation that I made between 2017 and 2020. So I'll now share a few still images of the film with you and share a little bit more about it. Let's see if I can get the screen sharing to work without sharing my notes this time, because of course, every presentation I share the images of the work and the notes. So let's see if I am lucky today. All right, because can anyone see the screen, or can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Right, wonderful. Thank you. So I made paisagens ficcionais, fictional landscapes, as a way of approaching the historical mining activity that has taken place in the region of Itabirito, the town I grew up in, since the 17th century. Time when the Portuguese colonizers first arrived in these lands specifically. And I approach this historical mining activity as a cycle of extraction and expropriation that is continuously reinvented. Itabirito, the land and town I grew up in, was named after its monolithic iron mountain that towers over the landscape, which in the indigenous language Tupi-Guarani means sharp, tall stone. This beautiful mountain, this beautiful monolith can be seen in paisagens ficcionais. Nowadays, the iron monolith is located in the center of one of the biggest iron ore mines in Brazil, the Mina do Pico, which a couple of friends of mine in an adventure helped me to invade. Since no one can really go into the mine, so we invaded it so that I could film the mining activity and the current state of extraction, both of the monolith and of the land surrounding it in Itabirito. So more broadly, paisagens ficcionais relates to the territory of and around Itabirito, the long history of mining in these lands, and particularly, it has a focus on the contemporary migration of the fragments of the mined landscape, which travel inseparably along with the currents of expropriated wealth from our local periphery to the centers of global capital. So the core of the work speaks to the impermanence of our landscape and how its dilapidation through extraction portrays the mechanisms and practices which constitute a colonial and capitalist ongoing. The film installation, I hope, invites the audience to consider these extractive practices and mechanisms in our lands and the history of the lands we occupy, the unceded lands of the Guarachués. Continuous historic practices that speak to the way in which our history may be a cycle of repetition of our past, of extraction, subjugation, expropriation, rather than a sequential and linear progressive unfolding of history en route for continuous improvement. The film installation includes found archival footage of the beginning of the 20th century, produced by research institutions from the United States in Brazil. So these archival images show extractive infrastructure, scientific experiments, transportation of extracted forms of life, flows and circulation of fragments of the mined landscapes in Brazil, as well as daily life scenes in the so-called global north, as well as metaphorical and stereotypical images of the global south, as for instance, moving images of preguiças, which are sloths in English, which can be considered an indexical reference to laziness in the tropics. These archival images are interwoven with the images that I produced myself, both of the invaded mine and of the melting totem of water and minerals. This totem, an ossified reference to memory in paisagens ficcionais, is liquefied and permeates the pores of the landscape, finding new routes. the minerals in the totem that we can see in the image. That's a close-up image of the totem. I collected in the mine Mina do Pico that my friends and I invaded together. These minerals, they were given back to a neighboring land, a land which, according to modern standards of urbanism, is categorized as a preservation area, such a different category than the neighboring mine. The melting water and the falling minerals from the totem signify beyond their categories as inanimate life. My attempt in interweaving these images, putting these images together and displaying them in multiple screens asynchronously is an attempt to place us in a cycle of repetition of history that indicates not only the continuous expropriation and subjugation, but also the continuous ingenuity, intelligence, and strength in resisting the violence of modernity and coloniality, and of course, capitalism, which continue in full force today. The question of the embodiment of time and of history and of their passing, of their unfolding, is central in my artistic practice in general, and it's particularly relevant in paisagens ficcionais. As I shared, I attempt to touch this dominant idea of sequentiality, both poetically and sarcastically sometimes, and particularly this idea of sequentiality of time, this progressive and linear development of history with its violent aim of a supposed improvement, as if modernity were indeed a place of arrival. By placing expropriation, exploration, and subjugation in the cycle of repetition of history, I hope to invite the audience to consider these mechanisms not as mere side effects to be overcome, but as constitutive and essential practices and mechanisms for the continuity of colonial and capitalist projects. And with that, I would like to speak of the connections that I perceive between paisagens ficcionais and the call of the show to environmental sensing or environmental sensory. So sequentiality, as I shared, like this notion of progressive and linear unfolding of history with a supposed idea that in this progressive passage of time, we are in a process of improvement, is one of the pillars of modern thought. Along with sequentiality, determinacy and separability are other sustaining pillars of modern thought. And here I am drawing from the magnificent and powerful work of artist and philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva, which I invite everyone to know in case you didn't have the chance to come across her work yet. She's amazing. So by engaging with environmental sensing, engaging with environmental sensing for me is a continuous attempt to dissolve these pillars of modern thought, determinacy, separability, and sequentiality. Dissolve and undo the need to determine and separate in a linear and evolving embodiment of time. Dissolve and undo the modes of knowing and modes of being, that is, the epistemological and ontological apparatuses that determines, separates existences within sequentiality. So for me, environmental sensing means dissolving, undoing, or decolonizing categories created to hierarchize modes of being and modes of knowing. And what I mean by this is sensing as a human and more than human mode of knowing through embodied perception is a mode of knowing. A mode of knowing that was buried, that was categorized as inferior and illegitimate by the modern colonial episteme, in favor of reason as the only enabler of knowledge. Reason became and is still considered the mark of the human, that is, the attribute which defines the human as man, mind, as the knower, thinker of the truth of things. And here I continue to be inspired by Da Silva's work. So by rescuing sensing, as I said, as a mode of knowing through embodied perception, we can know and be with reason and beyond reason, with no hierarchies. We can know and validate knowing through a multiplicity of possibilities of perception and cognition. So environmental sensing, in the way I interpret it, is knowing and being beyond the categories that determine, separate, and ultimately hierarchize modes of being, doing, and knowing. It is knowing each other, all and every being and particle in our environment, as we resonate with each other and sense each other. Environmental sensing can also be undoing the environment as a category of a separate and exterior existence, a sphere of being beyond ourselves. As we dissolve and undo determinacy, separability, and sequentiality, we may perceive ourselves as constitutive of the environment and the environment as constitutive of ourselves, losing the marks and boundaries of beginning and end, losing the marks that impose fabricated, socially constructed notions of difference and hierarchies, which naturalize domination. As we dissolve and undo categories and its inherent hierarchies of being and knowing, we allow us to relate to know, and sense all that exists beyond determinations and separations. We allow us to experience being in relation, not as individuals, but as porous continuums. I've been practicing how to pronounce this word, but as porous continuums with respectability. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Luíza. That is wonderful. And 大家要拜托你们把你们的麦克风先关掉哦。我们现在还有一些听众的麦克风是没有关掉的，请你们留意一下，你们的左下角有一个静音的按钮。Thank you, Luíza. And the second participating artist, Nancy Dayanne Valladares, is an interdisciplinary artist and filmmaker from Honduras. So, well, if you go to see our exhibition while watching her film, now exhibiting, you may feel you are reading an audio-visual diary and vegetal imaginaries and specters that lie within. So now Nancy will share more about her art practice with us. Nancy, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sophie. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Can you guys see that? Like, okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And Luíza, thank you so much also for such a beautiful and inspiring text. I'm actually very happy to be here today with former friend, former colleagues, still colleagues, dear friends, with whom we've been kind of working on these projects together for a long time, and it is really nice to see them and hear about them one more time. And also I'm very excited to see this project, Botanical Ghosts, sort of take on a new life and see it be shown in a new context. And it was actually super nice to frame this talk around the topic of sensing, specifically environmental sensing, because this project actually began as a kind of like foray into that. And in some ways, I think like this idea of the ghostliness of the ghost itself behind this whole project, there are particular histories and hauntings that can only be accessed through other ways of sensing, other ways of knowing. And to me, the story of Lancetilla Botanical Experimental Station, the Acufruit and Dorothy Pompano is just the tip of the iceberg, to dig deeply into the history of plantation worlds that emerged from the station. And I think that through multiple ways of sensing and knowing and many kinds of like memories, that is how one begins to unearth these kind of ghosts that are behind, I think, the Anthropocene. And I keep thinking about what our colleague Rae always talks about, which is how our bodies are hosts to myriads of companies, of beings, of ensuring that our experience in this world is never one of a singular entity, but rather one that is situated within an array of different kinds of experiences in the world, from different kinds of species of beings. And very recently, I was listening to this podcast that was part of the Transmediale series of broadcasts. It's really good. You guys should really listen to it. It was called "The Body is Not a Sovereign Object," and it was a conversation between Alexis Shotwell, Margarita Mendez, and Danielle Maria Adnes. And they were talking about how this kind of illusion of border thinking of the body and the skin as a barrier is a fallacy. With the skin being one of our largest sensing organs, I keep thinking actually about how in Western metaphysics, many times it turns towards vision as a primary way of sensing the world, or this something called ocular centrism. And in this way, actually, nature is flattened, and philosopher Michael Marder talks about this thing called the optical flattening of the vegetal world, which is an abstraction that happens oftentimes, that is often literal, but is often epistemic when we talk about kind of plant thinking and critical plant studies, and I guess like ways of living with and thinking with plants. And so for me, like working on this film and on this project was actually a big shift for me, a big kind of way of thinking, shifting my way of thinking in terms of, what does plant agency look like, and what does it mean, to look at history through a non-anthropocentric lens, or a lens that is less anthropocentric, I would say. And I think the film itself for me was involved the reflattening and mediating or remediating of materials from several different kinds of archives, and once again participating in the same flattening or optical compression of vegetal life. But it was definitely a really wonderful experience in shifting of perspectives. I think that the way that we look towards the past, and particularly through the lens of the ackee fruit, was a very interesting kind of like beginning for the rest of my practice, and in thinking about how can these plant exchanges, how can supply chains, flows of matter during colonial and imperial projects tell us about our environment today, and about the way that these places existed at a certain point in time. And more importantly, I wonder, like, what can these things tell us about our present or predict for our future? And these questions for me have multiple implications. The first one is a kind of like maybe more esoteric one, which is this idea of thinking about hauntings, about ghosts, as a way of engaging with living things, the living and the non-living. And I was just thinking about what Luíza said. We talked about these kind of mineral subjectivities and the ways in which we negotiate what we consider to be living, what we considered to be non-living, and what is worth saving, and what isn't. And I think that in Lancetia Botanical Experimental Station, which is where this film was shot, we look at this kind of cross-temporal dialogue that happens between Dorothy Popenoe and the ackee, as a way of invoking, these things that perhaps one might consider occult practices of speaking with the dead, but as a way of kind of shifting and altering, I think, historical narratives. And the other kind of implication is a material one, which, is this very real thinking, that there are literal traces of materials, of nutrients, of genetic information that is encoded into the plant matter that exited and entered through Lancetia, this particular site in Honduras. And the plantation models that kind of, and ecosystems that emerge from that place have these very, exacting colonial roots, but they've evolved into these enormous kind of giant machines and mechanisms of pesticide-laden monocultures that rely on, the infrastructure of fossil capital for distribution. And, through these kind of like systems, entire new chemical configurations, entered our bodies through our mouths, through the things that we're consuming, through the air that we breathe, through the barriers of our skin, which is once again one of our largest sensory organs, but we don't think about it as such oftentimes, due to this kind of like vision-centric, oculocentric perception of the world that is very particular to Western contexts. And I constantly, think and ask myself about this kind of transformation of matter, of flows, of disinterments and geological shifts that happen when you move soil from one place to another. And this notion that soil as well is part of this huge, biological infrastructure of in agriculture. It is a finite resource, and we don't think of it that way. It's one that we can consume, but we cannot regenerate with enough speed to sustain the ravenous hunger of extractive capital. And so this idea, I think, of shifting the frequency under which we sense our environment, of thinking with humidity, with temperatures, with the atmosphere and all of its weather idiosyncrasies, or maybe even thinking about sound and vibration as other ways of knowing is really, really, really important. And so for me, like, I'm really, really interested in the ways that this exhibit can be an opening, you know, towards other ways of thinking, of knowing, through different kind of other sensory apparatuses, and sort of to stabilize, you know, these very traditional, very like anthropocentric, I think, ways of seeing and witnessing the world. And yeah, I'm like really just sort of excited to kind of talk about maybe what this means for everyone else in the exhibit. I wanted to briefly touch on some other things that I've been sort of working that are kind of related to this in a way. And it has to do with the kind of chemical sort of legacies of photography and film, which is a very different kind of foray into, I think, photography and filmmaking. And it's looking at the kind of like material histories, I think, of what went into the creation of photography as a medium, of the materials that were kind of extracted from it and extracted in order to kind of create, you know, this machine, this sort of visual apparatus that we, you know, like now take for granted. And so I've been doing some experiments with silver, which is the material that is used in photographic film in order to, you know, create images. You know, film being, silver being a light sensitive material, like kind of sensor on its own, which reacts to sunlight or UV light, and it changes over time. And so a lot of these experiments kind of come from, you know, these initial forays into filmmaking, into photography, and into the history of plant matter, with in order to produce, you know, film, for example, it requires the, you know, not only the extraction of silver, but also the creation of celluloid requires, you know, very intensive logging of beech trees that are used in order to create plastics that go into film. And then the gelatin comes from a particular set of animal bones that are then boiled and turned into, you know, this material that the silver kind of like comes together, you know, to form the surface of a photograph. And so these, I'm very excited about these experiments, and you know, I hope that, I don't know, like maybe it relates in many ways to these ideas of switching, I think, our modes of seeing, our modes of sensing towards other subjectivities. So yeah, I'm gonna send it over to the next person. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy. So the third artist, Chucho, he's a Mexican artist and architect working in the intersection of art, architecture, and technology. And he also works as creative director and partner in the Rap Lab, and our co-organizer. The Rap Lab is an art, architecture, and urbanism firm with projects related to housing, urban design, public space interventions, and cultural management. And he's also co-founder of BIMA, a cultural center in Mexico. And in this plastic soup project, he and 𝐒𝐥𝐵 Hao brought the project public infrastructure prototypes for a city of the future from Mexico to Taiwan. Now, Chucho will share more about his art practice with us. Chucho, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sophie, for the introduction, and Luíza and Nancy for those very beautiful presentations. Okay, so I will start sharing. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
I hope. Okay, so I'm Chucho. As Sophie said, I'm an artist and an architect, and I'm very excited with this project. First of all, because I get to keep on working with very good friends, and we get to stay in touch, not just because we're friends, but also because we are working together. And I don't know, that's a super beautiful experience. Okay, so I'll try to do it as easy and fast as possible. So for me, environmental sensing, or my approach to sensing, and more specifically environmental sensing, is through what I call interfaces for multiscalar calibration. So in general, I want to understand why can't we relate to environmental phenomena, even if we seem to have the technology to do so. And even after seeing like the graphs, the data, visualizations, and having like the gadgets, we don't seem to be responding to the current climate emergency in one hand. And in the other, we don't seem to come up with a different way of understanding how to live together. Of course, this is related, and I agree very much with what Nancy was saying on these very Western views of how to manage the environment, or even just the idea of trying to manage an environment, right? So scale for me in this sense is very important and very difficult to grasp with only the tools that we think we have to deal with the environment, right? So it reminds me a lot to this very famous Al Gore conference, where he's trying to demonstrate in this graph with this elevator what is the scale of this, or the scale of the urgency of climate change, right? So, but still there's something missing there, right? So I'm interested in understanding how can we relate to these multiple scales in different ways, and not just like visual or linear ways of relating to the environment, right? So how can we relate to different scales through in more effective, performative, aesthetic, and or collaborative ways, and which is the case of the project that gathers us today, right? So for this, I'm working on a series of interfaces that can not only help us negotiate and understand what the scale of our climate emergency is, but to find new ways of relating to each other beyond the transactional. To sense collectively, for me, comes as a call to get in the way, misused buildings, instruments, stories, preconceptions of space and ownership, and of course, to take technology and use it in contradictory ways. For me, it is essential to misuse not only structures present in the built environment or in bureaucracy, but also the ones present in technological devices, so that new possibilities can be opened. Interfaces are meant in this way to reimagine new ways of experiencing the environment and our relation to more than human entities, and of entering the break that exists between scales and modes of understanding the environment. As we know, there are geological layers bigger than countries and bodies of water bigger than nation states. Sovereignties are always contested while shifting scales. So how and where to start this recalibration? How to provoke other ways of sensing? I propose to do it through a series of interfaces that are deployed in the public sphere in the form of walking antennas, scanning devices, hearing instruments, water-seeking vehicles, or repurposed architectural structures. What if we were to understand such invisible matters while navigating and allowing ourselves to be navigated by them? What other ways of perceiving invisible environmental scales would we have while navigating in a non-static way? So for me, it's very important to understand this idea of sensing, and what we need to sense, and what does this relate between localities and an understanding of a planetary scale, right? So for me, movement is very important, and I like to think of walking as a unit of measurement as well. So if we are dealing with time and space problems, speed is an obvious factor to consider. So what is the correct speed at which to measure or sense the planetary? For me, it's 5 kilometers an hour, more or less, or even less. 5 kilometers might be even too fast, which is the speed that we walk. So in a way, like, I think walking is accessible, it's free, it's chaotic, it's slow for modern standards. It provides a sense of scale, and it has like this whole array of characteristics. But I mean, for me, walking is understanding, and walking can never be done in a straight line. So for me, this part of walking is more like a methodology than a medium in a way. And that brings the idea of traces, right? So if we are sensing and we are moving through space, we are generating traces that can become data. So the mentioned interface aid and produce new readings and ways of navigating that can produce new notations and subjective cartographies out of such experiences. So cartographies in this sense are understood as soundscapes, images, notation, traces, or even marks on the same interfaces that generate cartographies, or understood in another way, they are generating data. So an interface in this sense for me is applicable not just between humans, but between multiple layers or bodies, between body and city, between citizens, infrastructure and landscape, between movement, experience, structures, humans, non-humans, and borders, sidewalks, fishes, helicoidal structures, or even regional music. So I'm just gonna talk to you about maybe 3 projects which are related more to maybe sensing, and then could maybe open the way for the conversation about the project that we're gonna show today. So this is Interface 1 or Interface 1, which is a walking duplicator that works as a communication device in the public realm. And it's very important for me that because of its scale, it has to reclaim public space to be activated. So by doing so, the walking vehicle acts as an interface between bodies and the city, negotiating choreographed and regulated spaces with the movement of gear mechanism and printing rolls. The interface leaves a trace of the action of going through a space and the attempt to replicate the message that is printed as the rolls are activated by pushing the vehicle. It appropriates gear mechanisms present in offset printers and mimeographs, together with dollies and communication vehicles found in the city. Mixing both elements, the interface camouflages itself in public space, resembling an utilitarian object. So as it gets deployed, interface 1 leaves a fading message as a trace that repeats as the vehicle is pushed and is affected by the rugosity of the city's surface, acting both as a conveyor and a duplicator of messages, but also as a vibratory device that tracks and registers the tremors of a walk. Interface 1 is both a fading duplicator and a dysfunctional seismographer. So this is maybe like a collection of 3 other interfaces which are kind of doing similar things. They're kind of like a small family, which are interface 2, 3, y 4, or interface 2, 3, and 4. So with the idea of the interface as a sensor, the driving notion was to create objects with uncanny capacity that generated new narrative structures and ways of understanding different scales, as I mentioned before. So the aim was to generate these other cartographies that could come out of such interfaces and come up with information provoked mainly by not following linear layers of the environment, and create a repository that collects the data generated by such interfaces. Some of them act as turntable needles that generate soundscapes and graphical notations by being activated through piezo microphones attached to axes and tails, and that record vibrations, or interfaces that translate the movement of a walk through a set of wheels that, when attached to a differential, provoke simultaneous vertical and horizontal movements. Or others that, like this one, that hold direct relation to how layers of a city respond to topographical and geological layers. Not to mention bringing attention to invisible presence of water in the environment, which is the case of radiesthesia. or water-seeking rods. So this, I think, is interface 7, which is a mobile device capable of scanning and intercepting signals from the spectrum known as VHF, belonging as well to polysync communication, wireless networks, and FM radio. So I think it's important here to note that I am interested to relate to planetary scales, not just present in nature, but also man-made planetary scales like radio, for example, or waveform. So this is more related towards telecommunication and how can we relate to these invisible aspects of the bureaucratization of the environment, right? So this one is deployed by walking and is navigated by searching for signals or listening either to surveilling technologies or highly interconnected local spaces. Interface 7 is deployed with a special suit that reflects laser imaging detection and ranging confusing infrared devices such as proximity sensors, automatic sliding doors, and sometimes automatic bathroom sinks. This one is a walking antenna that utilizes a receiver circuit connected to a discone antenna. There is a jack attached to a wheel mast. Interface 7 navigates public space looking for concentrations of signal and radiating waves, intercepting telecommunication radiation, and at the same time occupying spaces while navigating the environment in a nonlinear way. And in this way, I think I will connect it to this other project, which is 𝐒𝐴Lwife Interplanetary Antenna, as I like to call it. And here I was very interested on understanding, I was doing some research on antennas, and I really like the idea of helixes or helicoidal structures, such as this one. And I'm also interested not just in these instruments, but also how can we, with the pretext of sensing, or like with saying that we are sensing something or measuring something, how can we occupy spaces, right? So I call it occupy by appearing occupied. So I try to convert a helicoidal parking lot into an antenna to see what could we get on the other side, like what would be the signal that we could catch, right? So the question was like, can a building become an antenna, or better, can a building that already possesses a specific shape be converted into an antenna that uses its structure and form to receive a signal? And if so, what would it receive? It would be a massive antenna. Perhaps it would receive myriad signals, extraterrestrial information, right? So this is just like a very open question. So a parking lot in this sense could become an interplanetary antenna, and which receives data from the environment and the planetary radiation phenomena transmitted through electromagnetic waves. So with the help of 500 feet of bare copper wire, taking like its 4 turns at 14 degrees, and like an open sky, very beautiful helix, we managed to convert the 𝐒𝐴Lwife planetary antenna into like an actual receiver for 𝐒𝐴Lwife waveform, which could potentially be hearing Schumann resonance coming from lightning, short-term earthquake prediction, and correlated with tropical air temperatures or the monitoring of global warming. So with the help of 10 collaborators, 𝐒𝐴Lwife station parking lot was in fact converted into an antenna that received this waveform for approximately 2 hours by holding this copper bare wire around its helical structure, and we managed to generate the necessary form to connect our helical antenna shape to the electronic box on a grounding rod placed in the middle of the helix. So we could finally, working together with the help of like 10 friends, we could finally listen to electromagnetic waves collectively. So I think I'll just finish there with maybe just, I think, like very nice jumps towards the project that we are not just presenting today, but like we are all part of, and how it has been super beautiful at this for me to just start talking about these ideas and see like those relations that we all have with environmental sensing, which is I think not just a research or just an interest, but it's like a very necessary question for everyone's practice in a way. So I think I will just stop there and maybe hand it over to Po-Hao and start talking about maybe like these 3 pieces that we made for the show.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chucho.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and also talk about our exhibition, which is happening on site in Treasure Hill. And as Sophie mentioned, this collaboration included exhibition and also prototype developing, and a series of workshops focusing on open data, environmental sensing, and how can we use data to create different kind of sensory feedbacks. And let me share my screen. So yeah, what you can see is one of the prototype we have in Treasure Hill. Maybe Chucho can talk about this device.
I was going to talk about this device. Did
Oh,
you, why don't you introduce the dandelion and then
yeah,
I can share my
okay,
screen.
Sure, yeah. So one of the device is about the light, because in urban area, artificial light is one of the most prominent artificial creations that affects our everyday experience. And so we call this device interface 1. Halo is a dandelion-like device that reacts to the surrounding light environment by lighting itself up as a night light in the dark. So when the device senses light from various directions, the area which receives the lighting will be dimmed. So you can see the scale is a quite large device, and when it receives, it has light sensors, the light resistor on the device. So when the light comes from different directions, it reacts to the surrounding light environment. And yeah, so yeah, this is one of our prototype. Should we talk about all the 3 devices, or should I continue talk about my project?
I think we can introduce 3 devices first.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
And then we can talk about your apparatus.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Po-Hao. So for a little context, the 3 devices that we made were according to environmental sensing in the sensor kits that BIMA developed. So we drew from data such as like air quality or noise pollution, or what else was there? Air, noise, water quality. So like there are different qualities that the sensor kits could encompass. So we drew from that. And I'm just gonna share my screen. Before I introduce the interface number 2, Chucho's presentation, the example you used reminded me of this work. And it's a work by Steve Kurtz. It was presented during the Documenta 13. And it's this is a chart of the wealth and poverty differences in the world. And so it begins with like the people with the least, and it builds up as wealth builds up. And up here it's like where the wealthiest populations reside. And then all the way, I think a few kilometers above it, there's a helicopter that has a sign that this is where the 1% lies. So the reason I'm bringing up this example is that it demonstrates really well how data is a very important form of knowledge, but if the knowledge isn't embodied in a way, it doesn't really land in the body. And so I think this is what Steve was trying to do with this piece, to show you just how vast the differences are between the 1% and the rest. And with these devices, it was kind of a similar thinking. So we have this more technological element of the project where it's about citizen science and giving people the tools to sense their own environment and collect that data so they know what is in the environment. And the other side of this project which is these 3 devices that we made, were more about a poetic kind of sensing, or a more embodied form of sensing. And so this device number 2 is based on, it went through multiple iterations. So in the beginning, it was based on the noise pollution element of the sensor kit. And so we're thinking, so we knew right away that we wanted these devices to be activated by the body somehow. We didn't want to make sculptures or installations that stayed in the room. We wanted the body to be how these pieces were experienced and were brought to life. And then in the beginning, we also wanted to make them collaborative machines. So we were imagining like you need 4 people to drag one of these machines. And then because of COVID considerations, this is kind of a solution we came up with. It's mostly used for like one-on-one interactions. And this machine on the right is the interface number 2. Originally, we were going to use the mechanism of Edison's recording cones. I don't know if any of you in the audience don't know about this, but the beginning of like recording technology was with these wax cones that registered sound waves through a pin. So kind of like the vinyl player. And we wanted to use that mechanism, but turn it upside down and build it into this traveling machine that registered the topography of the landscape that it was passing through, and carved out the vibrations of that onto wax. And after some technical considerations, for example, the wax melting or the record not being long enough, we landed in this device, which is more like a seismograph for recording like movements of the earth, the earthquakes. And so it's a spring-loaded heavyweight a rock cast that acts as a heavy weight that swings the pen underneath it, a spring-loaded pen, according to the movement of this whole cart. There's a close-up of the pen mechanism and a close-up of the drawings that it made when it was pulled, and some images of audiences interacting with it. And I really like this photo because it kind of shows like how much force you have to exert to make this piece move. Yeah, so I liked what Nancy was saying about thinking of sound and vibration as other ways of knowing, because I feel like this piece is kind of what it's about. It's gone through like multiple layers of translation of what sound, noise, and listening can be. And so it becomes more of a movement, a vibration, and almost like a choreograph of the body with this device on the landscape that it's traversing through. So it's like an understanding of auditory sensing through a kind of synesthesia. Yeah, that's it for me.
Should I describe the kite
Yes.
briefly? So yeah, so I think Ray put it very nicely. As I think, yeah, all of them went through this very nice set of translations. I think, as like the first idea was, yeah, of course, to take the sensor, and what it was doing is, of course, a sensor can be like 1 millimeter, right? So I think in a way what we're doing is like scaling up whatever this sensor is doing and bringing it to a scale of the scale necessary for, I don't know, like audiences to engage with those layers or environmental scales through these devices, right? So I think we also had very nice conversations about autographic sensors and how analog or computational a sensor can be. And we did, I think, a very interesting research on like tracing back these sensors and what does it mean to sense, right? Because at the end, like we have these very specialized high-tech little devices, but we like the history of of science at the end is full of sensors that didn't use computation like per se, but they're always making some sort of like autographic or like analog kind of sensing, right? Like in our terms right now. So I think in a way there's something very nice about like the three pieces, which are, they have like different levels of technicalities or like analogness in a way. And I really like that that process. So I think for me, in a way, it was interesting to use them not as like these very precise machines or like these very precise instruments for measuring like this or that, and or to give like very specific data, but just for us and the audience or people that are interested in like navigating with these interfaces to like recognize things that we already know, right? Like when you walk around with this dandelion and you see it reacting to light, it puts something in your mind, and then you start realizing or recognizing light in your environment, like, or in your immediate scale. Or when you move around with this seismograph, you start understanding how steep or not a hill might be, or even like your own street. And that, we hope, triggers something within our understanding of these bigger scales we are still part of, right? So it's more about recognizing than I think of generating exact traces of things, right? So in the case of the kite, we wanted to take one of like the most famous autographic sensors, which is a cyanometer, which measures like the blueness of the sky, and it was thought that it will give like navigation information to measure atmospheric pressure, and it aided sailors in a way, or like you could predict certain behavior in a larger scale if you could relate the color of the sky with some set of observations that were already kind of related to this instrument. And talking about air, of course, I think we jumped towards the idea of kites, or like instruments that used air, of course, to move. So we mixed both ideas, and if we just said like, what if we just make like this kind of cyanometer that just flies in the sky, and then it also becomes invisible in a way when it matches the color of the sky, right? So we started making this one. Okay, so this is Bell's, Alexander Graham Bell from Bell's laboratories, research on tetrahedral kites, or like tetrahedral cell kites or structures. So we found it very interesting also because this is the beginning of aviation, right? There's no airplane still when this photo was taken. And you can see also like this, there's super beautiful elements. So we recreated like a very simple shape, which at the end it's a triangular tetrahedron, and it acts more or less as a fractal. So it's very easy to assemble. And then we mix the idea of this of the cyanometer to then make it some sort of autographic sensor. But also, of course, by flying a kite, you start reacting, or you start recognizing again what is the role of air or wind where you live, right? Like when it's a windy day, or it's not a windy day, or how does it affect your life in a way, right? So that's kind of the purpose of the three of them, and also like more specifically about this like tetrahedron third interface. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chucho.
Thank you. So, Po-Hao, you are going to share us about the sensor, right?
Yes, so I will start
we
with,
don't have many time left, so maybe we can keep it short.
yes, so let me share about the sensor. In addition to our prototyping devices and the exhibition, as part of the project, we hosted a workshop that introduced participants and open source environmental sensor kits. This time, both Mexico and Taiwan side, we choose smart citizen kits, since the creative agent BIMA in Mexico already used these sensor kits to start a series of public events. So this sensor kit is developed by Fab Lab Barcelona, and it's an open source sensor kit that it sends different values in our environment, like temperature, humidity, air pressure, and those particles. And we use this smart citizen kit because we can take advantages of its public data platform and API configuration, so we can reuse those data more easily to make, for example, sonify or visualize those data, or compare different sensors in the network, or to observe the change in our environment. We have a short video that shows the different parts of the sensor and how can we assemble it. Yeah, so the only thing is you need to have the ready-made circuit board, and you assemble different parts of the sensor. The blue box is a component for sensing particles like PM2.5, PM10. And once you finish assembling the sensor kits, you just need to connect the device, the sensor kits to your home Wi-Fi, and then you can name your sensor kits. And publish your data to the platform. And with the provided API, you can reuse this data. This project continues one of my previous projects, which I named it as selected ambient airs. I will spend like 3 minutes to introduce this project. So I did one project in 2019 together with British Council and FACT Liverpool from the UK. So we try to use, so at that time, we also developed a methodology and learning process with public participants and workshops and IoT, Internet of Things technology to create a environmental sensing network. But at that time, we used Raspberry Pi, and we try to connect all the sensor components with pre-programmed software. So we have different steps, including the first step is to build the environmental sensor. And so you can see our workshops, and we also collaborate with high school teachers. And the second part is to create your own open data. The environmental sensor module gathers data from its environment and publish over MQTT protocol in Node-RED platform. We can create our data set from those environmental data transmitted from sensor modules and give access to others with a simple GUI interface. In other words, everyone can download the environmental monitoring data with the internet, as well as contribute a new node according to the provided configurations. So I'm showing some of the process. And after we build our own data set, the step 3 is the solidification experiments at that time. So yeah, we put a sensor in different locations. This is the Node-RED platform. And so the sonification process is we start with the method of sonification that draws on existing resources to connect various systems as the basis to facilitate cooperative conversations, seek mutual alternation of perspectives through the reflection and interpretation of reasons in our environment. So we try to map different data to various kind of audio synthesis parameters, but conceptually mapping numbers to parameters of sound is it's not really listened to the environment, but on the conceptual level, the idea of listen to our environment may change the way we perceive music and natural phenomena. So that's why me and Chucho and our collaborating artists choose to continue this kind of public engagement and environmental sensing with sensor kits, but also with those prototyping devices. We may use or may not use electricity and and computer or software. So we have different directions to perceive our those fluctuations in our environment. Okay, so Sophie, should we continue to Rae?
Now we only 1 minute left. Are you all sleepy? No, can we continue? Because I think maybe the audience will have some question. 大家好，因为其实现在美国那边时间上已经蛮晚的，所以呢，我想要了解，就是想先让大家知道，想先问大家有没有什么问题可以先提问，趁他们现在精神正好比较好的时候。那如果你有问题的话呢，你可以就是留言在我们的聊天室里面，也可以举个手，然后打开你的麦克风或视讯，然后让我们知道。有没有任何人想提问呢？不然今天这样就放过他们，有一点可惜，难得大家现在齐聚一堂。那如果有问题的话，可以就是先留言在里面。那我自己也是可能有一些问题想要问。So we let the audience to leave the questions in the chat room if they have. So Po-Hao, do you want to share more, or we can discuss something else?
Yes, sure. Yeah, if Rae want to share, or if we all agree to start the Q&A session, that could be also nice.
Yeah, I think we should do Q&A.
Okay.
We can chat while the audience composes their questions.
Yeah.
I do have a question that is more a conceptual one. And the speech you have are all amazing, but I would like to know, like Chucho, he used more like for me it's a more practical way, like all kinds of measure tools to collect the data. So, and Nancy and Luíza, for me, they're using more like more abstract way of thinking to interpret the relation between human and the world, everything in the world. So I'm just curious, when you do your art practice, when you doing the creating, how do you avoid like seeing things with human as the subjectivity again? How to avoid those prejudice in your creation? Why are you laughing?
No, it's a great
No, it's just-
question because it's honestly very difficult. This all too humanly frame of reference is really all that we've been taught, and it's an ongoing practice. Oh, I did want to ask the land rights that Luíza did in the beginning. That's kind of part of it, part of trying to decenter the human as subject by acknowledging kind of the land that the human is tied to, that the human has come through by the history of the relationship between the human and the land. I was just wondering, because I haven't been back to Taiwan in a bit, I was wondering if this was something that people have started talking about, because I don't believe I have seen or heard about land right acknowledgements in Taiwan yet, even though Taiwan most of the city is built on indigenous land that were also like pushed to reservations or out of the city center. But I don't think it's a conversation that's very robust in Taiwan yet. So I wanted to perhaps ask the audience or Sophie, if you know, if this is a thing in Taiwan.
I'm not sure about this. I'm also curious. I suddenly see this kind of information here in Taiwan, or maybe in art scene, we seldom mention this.
I put the translation, the Chinese translation in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Sophie, I also think that, oops, sorry.
Go ahead, Luíza.
I was just like thinking that, you know, in thinking about sensing and ways that we can maybe consider knowledge and communication beyond what Western and human-centered modes of perception have taught us, we maybe are in the process, right, of learning how we can maybe forge interpretations that are not so much human-centered. But I do think, like, I think your question goes to the core of things, because we are always on the verge of impossibility, right, of doing something, because we are, of course, humans communicating in the way that we have learned how to communicate, and we are trying to interpret and to sense beyond what we maybe already know, and that's an experimental thing. So of course we walk on the verge to fail, but it's still, I think, very worth trying it out.
There's someone in the audience that's raising their hand.
Hello, 请举手的这位 Don.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Don Changwen. Yeah. Thanks for all the artist talks, and yeah, I learned a lot from this event, and yeah, I appreciate you guys sharing this knowledge and informations. I'm very interesting about like the Luíza about like the land right things, because I'm from Taiwan as well, but recently I'm living in Western Australia, which is a bigger mining state in Australia, and we also have some like issues with like indigenous culture and also the land right things, like how we gonna explore like the land and using that as like for mining industry, such as like a coal field, or like it kind of damage the environment, but because of like the capitalism, because the fossil fuels, like the industry still dominate the nowadays society. So I think this is the thing for me. I really want to knowing more about like how like science and also like Western science, or like indigenous cultures, like how more like spiritual things, and also like I think for us like Taiwanese, we also have maybe like Confucius or like Luíza, something like respect of land things, this kind of thing. I think there's some relationship, the connection between those three things, like you mentioned about like ontologies, like how the material or like object are all equal, like humans shouldn't be like in the center. Yeah, this is the things I'm interested in. I would like to know more about like what do you guys think. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for your question. I think you brought so many core aspects of so many issues that we face today in a planetary moment of crisis and climate catastrophe and all that. And I think essentially, I think what's very helpful in thinking about those things is that, and I think what is very transformative, at least for me, to think about coloniality and how we look at like Western science and land rights and mining and all of those activities within capitalism is that there is a dominant right mode of looking and understanding things that was imposed on most people that exist on Earth, which is the Western system of knowledge has really dominated and been imposed upon most of us. And when we perceive the world very often, I mean, we is a very complicated way of saying things, but when I perceive the word very often, I am looking to it through a lens that is only one lens, but it's not necessarily the reality of things. And I think when you bring in indigenous lands and spiritual dimensions and relationship to land that have a significance and importance that is beyond maybe what Western capitalist ideas see in land, like resources, accumulation of possibilities of building wealth and all that, we start to maybe perceive ourselves, other humans and more than humans beyond maybe what one and only lens allow us to see. So I think that it's very helpful to, I think what I was trying to talk about, like the undoing of things, is really try to recognize how the way we are taught about things is not necessarily the ways that they, I don't know if that's making sense, but the way we are taught, dominantly taught about seeing the world is not necessarily the only way that we can go about it, and that other ways of perceiving and knowing and being, and definitely indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies and their conceptions of what land is and what land means and how much land is part of their own body in their own existence. They are as legitimate as any other way of looking at a pile of iron ore and identifying that as something specific, right? I don't want to say that identifying it as a resource is legitimate, because I do not believe in capitalism and colonialism, but I just want to say that there are multiple ways that we can engage and perceive what is around us. And it's not only through what we learn at school, what we learn in the media and all those dominant vehicles of Western indoctrination, essentially. Unfortunately, I have never been to the other part of the world from where I come from. So I've never been to Asia. I am not sure how the situation in Taiwan is. I appreciate very much the question that Rae asked. So I don't know how much that resonates to your context. But yeah, I also don't know if that answers your questions, but I'm happy to follow up if you have any other thoughts.
Thank you, Luíza. So about the land acknowledgement, actually Tzu-Tung, she studied this for a long time. Maybe she can share something with us.
Yeah, nice meeting you all. My last project is called Freconomy, and it's related to the land acknowledgement and the contract that people were having with the indigenous people, like the starting of the contract, of like how people make contract and how through making contract, colonizer repurpose the usage of the land. And I think like land, it's in general very important for indigenous culture. Like for example, in Taiwan, it's a crucial elements for the gender labor division. For example, woman is for Amis and for Bunyumayang, the woman is the one who inherits the land, and so woman is therefore like more in charge of and have more rights comparing to men in lots of time, and men are married to women in order to work on these lands. And I think another very big difference is that after the colonialism or after the overall nationalism is the tax system. Like the tax itself is a symbolized for like the national governments over a land. And so before that, lots of indigenous group would say they wouldn't have like the ownership idea, but instead they have the usership idea. But now it's like this part of idea was no longer exists or under the colonial regime. So it's very difficult to work on or to reconnect the tradition. The most famous issue recently in Taiwan include the 𝐒𝐨𝐮𝐩 case, which is a company trying to excavate and bomb the mountain in order to excavate the cement. Another, it's called a Kadatipu solar panel case, which is they put thousands acres of solar panel on the indigenous land, and it initiates lots of indigenous movement and activism and protests. But in all, recently and in recent year in Taiwan, and I think in Australia and many places in the world, one of the strategy that people are working on is trying to make indigenous digital map. They kind of navigate their land and trying to put their land on the digital map, and using this as a strategy to negotiate with the government or negotiate with the company, saying that what's the area of their traditional territories. The difficulties sometimes it's because it's comes to like not all the indigenous community have the resources to navigate their whole territory, but there will be like another issue, and yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So, 大家还有问题想要问他们吗？今天，因为我们其实已经超过时间蛮多的。如果今天大家都没有问题的话，我们真的就要把他们放走咯，很可惜。Okay, so no one have questions right now. So thank you so much, everyone. I think it's quite late, right? In the United States. I feel it's very interesting that I think from everyone's speech we can find that the environmental perception becomes your attempt to break the idea that human is the measure of all the things, and we try to re-evaluate the relationship between human beings and things, all the things in the world. And I'm looking forward to see this project Plastic Soup to have a next stage. We hope we can continue this project in the future. And everyone, please go to see our exhibition now, exhibit in Treasure Hill, Taipei, and you can see everyone's work in it Mhm. So thank you very much for joining us today. And now, good night. Good night
Thank
to
you.
you.